What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to an all-new episode of the Pack a Day Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. More importantly, I am joined once again after a hot second by the one and only Sam Monson. You can follow him on Twitter at PFF_Sam. Of course, he's the lead NFL analyst over at Pro Football Focus and the co-host of the PFF NFL Podcast. Sam, great to have you back. How the heck have you been?
Been good. How about you?
I've been fantastic. I know this is about as much of a downtime as we get in the NFL. We've got another 3 weeks before training camps kick off. What's your go-to at this time of year? Are you studying up on draft film for next year? Are you just trying to get as much rest and relaxation in as you can? What's your plan of attack at this point?
Yeah, like you said, this is the whatever passes for the offseason in today's NFL. So catching up on stuff that I've been putting off for like 9 months, things around the house, things I've got to do, things I haven't gotten around to yet. And then away we go again.
Yeah, it's crazy. In about 3 weeks, I know it's going to be training camp time, and then it just relaunches everything back off up until about this time again next year. Are you hitting up any training camps this year?
Yeah, I think we will. We've done it the last couple of years where we've obviously been to some Bengals stuff with Cincinnati being where PFF is based. We try and hit, joint scrimmages whenever they're facing somebody else. We've driven to Indianapolis because it's a couple of hours away. So we'll try, I think, and do some of the driving distance stuff, and then we'll see if we go a bit further afield anywhere.
Awesome. Well, we'll certainly look forward to that. Even though this is, of course, the sort of down period of the NFL, there's still always discussions to be had about certain things. And clearly one of those things is a Jordan Love contract extension. Seems to be one of the things that might actually get done in these next few weeks. We've had some interesting NFL contracts come out already this offseason. Kirk Cousins, 4 years, $180 million. Trevor Lawrence, 5 years, $275 million. Jared Goff, 4 years, $170. We're waiting on Love. Doesn't look like Prescott's going to get done. We're waiting on Tua. Let's talk about this Jordan Love contract. I know you've talked about it a little bit recently. Should the Packers try to get it done now? Should they try to wait? Should Love try to get it done now? Should he try to wait? What's sort of your overarching view of this negotiation between Jordan Love and the Green Bay Packers?
Yeah, I mean, I think both sides want it to get done. It will get done at some point. I think it's going to be a sort of a high end of the market type of contract, just based off what we saw from him late last season. And from it's an interesting one because the sample size of really high level play for Jordan Love is so small, right? Yeah. Which is not necessarily his fault. It's just the reality of the situation. But it was incredibly convincing and incredibly compelling. So on the one hand, and I'm the same. I look at Jordan Love last season. I'm like, all right, I buy it. I'm sold. What he did, particularly in the second half of the season, was so good. I'm in. I think he's the guy. I think he's for real, and his ceiling is incredibly high. On the other hand, we've all been doing this long enough to know that doesn't necessarily mean it's real. Like you have seen guys do things like that before, and then it stops happening and it goes away, and it's not the same, or it's a big step backwards or whatever. So it's difficult because on the one hand, you would say, look, if you knew that was who you were getting year on year on year. He's pushing. I mean, he's matching the $55 million a year deals from Trevor Lawrence that just got signed, and he's up there rivaling Dak Prescott with pushing for 60. And that's a reasonable place to be. But he doesn't have that resume yet. He doesn't have that backing of 3 or 4 years of really high level play already. We're just working from a smaller sample size, and I think that has to complicate the negotiations. It's difficult to know where it's complicating them. How much are Green Bay as an institution kind of pushing back and saying, look, we love him. We love Jordan. He's a great guy. He's the guy we want to tie down for long term. But let's be honest, we've only really seen it for half a year here. That's not $55 million a year so it's difficult to know exactly where it's going to impact the negotiations, but it feels like it has to, because it's just too big an elephant in the room to ignore completely.
It really is. And I think there's two things that are so interesting with this. One is that Green Bay has been sort of the standard bearer for how you transition from one quarterback to the other And it's worked phenomenally, going from Favre to Rodgers and now Rodgers to Love. And every NFL team would love to be in that sort of situation. But they do get themselves in this sort of interesting situation where all of a sudden the new quarterback that you have has this small sample size of play, and you immediately have to give them this huge contract. And again, most teams would be envious of that position overall, but it does give that little bit of doubt of, all right, is this real, or are we going to overpay for something that we're not entirely sure of yet? Of course, Green Bay is going to know Love better than anyone else from knowing him for these past few seasons. I think the other thing that we always know too, GMs love to give themselves outs, those just in case sort of things. And I think that to me is the most intriguing aspect of this entire negotiation is it Green Bay that pushes for a longer contract, or do they want to keep it like, hey, maybe we should just do 4 years just in case to, again, leave ourselves some sort of out here? Or is it Jordan Love and his agent that say, hey, we would love to get another bite at the apple in 3, 4, or 5 years, well, like whatever it is. So I think both sides of this is really intriguing to me as to not only how much money he gets, but how many years this deal ends up being for both sides.
Yeah, and generally what the structure of the deal is, because there are now, like 10 years ago, every quarterback contract looked the same, right? It was 5 years, it was a percentage guaranteed, and then it was the rest of sort of fake money at the end, and they all looked the same. It was just the number that was going higher and higher and higher. And since then, guys like Kirk Cousins have created these extra different pathways where not every quarterback contract looks the same now. And in particular, when you're getting these deals, the sort of first big money, second contract of a quarterback, there's a bunch of different pathways you can go down now. You can either go down a kind of Kirk Cousins route and say, I want a 3-year fully guaranteed deal. Or you can do the Patrick Mahomes thing and say, let's sign for a decade of, a number that looks ridiculous right now, but 3 years down the line looks like a bargain. Looks like the cheapest quarterback contract in the NFL type of thing. Or there's a sort of few different pathways along the way as well. So yeah, it is interesting to sort of know, Trevor Lawrence just signed a relatively kind of cookie cutter contract extension, but like, what does Jordan Love want out of his contract? Does he want a specific, does he want to maximize money? Does he want to be in Green Bay for the next decade? Like, what's important to him? Because that shapes what the contract looks like.
Yeah, and you never quite know exactly what that is either. I'm sort of more expecting a little bit more of the Trevor Lawrence type cookie cutter, whether it's 4 years or 5 years, kind of right around that money. What is your expectation? Do you think this gets done prior to training camp? Are you expecting more cookie cutter? And if anything, would a Patrick Mahomes sort of deal completely shock you? Would something shorter completely, like what are sort of your expectations going into this for the contract?
As you said, it's very difficult to know, because we don't know what he wants. Like we don't know what motivates Jordan Love, what is important for him, in his NFL career long term, other than simply being the best player that he can be. Like, what does he want to get out of this negotiation? Because that, I think, changes what the structure of that deal looks like. So absent knowing any of that, you kind of have to assume the default position of the next kind of cookie cutter deal, the next version of the Trevor Lawrence contract, and until we see anything different, and then try and reverse engineer why the contract ended up looking that way. What does this say about what's actually important to him?
Yeah, it's funny because I think everyone hones in and focuses on that. Is it 55 million? Is it 60 million? But for me, everything else is the far more interesting aspect of it. Is it 4 or 5 years or something totally different? Are there, how are the guarantees structured? Is it a real 4-year deal, or is it actually something that's like 2 years and then year? But like all those sort of things are going to be far more interesting to me when this contract eventually gets announced. I do think they try to figure out something prior to the start of training camp here, which gives them a little under 3 weeks to try to get this done. We'll see if they get it done in time or not. I know both sides were semi-optimistic before they broke for their off period. Kind of moving on from Jordan Love's contract to just Jordan Love, the quarterback. This is obviously regardless of contract size, another huge year for Jordan. He's coming off a second half of last season that was up there with pretty much any quarterback in the NFL. Now there's expectations. Now teams have more tape on him and are going to probably try to defend him differently than they did towards the second half of last year. What are your just expectations for Jordan going into this season?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. Just maintaining what he did last season, I think, is huge. And if we hadn't seen, if we hadn't seen the playoff performance against San Francisco, I think there would be no doubts whatsoever, other than simply small sample size, et cetera. That at least makes you a little bit twitchy, and I think you can explain it away with weather and, both quarterbacks played badly in that game or not up to their usual standards. So it's not like it was just him underperforming. But anytime you're dealing with a small sample size, you're like immediately you're looking for anything that kind of goes against the grain and goes in a different direction. So yeah, I think really just backing it up and doing it again and saying that the jump forward, the growth, the improvement from the first half of the season to the second half of the season, in particular, just basic ball location accuracy. Like that was the single biggest thing I think that improved. I think his decision making was better, and I think the sort of style that he was playing improved a little bit. And when we saw him taking better chances rather than just making more of them, but like I think that the real improvement, the really amazing thing about that change at sort of halfway point of the season was he was just laser accurate from that point on, dialed in, not just like completion percentage, but absolutely actually ball location, putting the ball half a foot to the left when he needed to, those kinds of things. There aren't that many quarterbacks you can think of that have like flipped a switch and gone from bad at that to good at that. And he did it like at the midway point of a season. It was kind of bizarre to watch, but did look like it was real.
It was interesting going through last season where, like you said, midway through, obviously you're watching the TV tape live, and, you can't see what's going on downfield. And every time the ball left his hand, you're like, okay, is this going to end up 5 yards left of where he's targeting? Is it like, what's going to happen towards this end of last year? Every time the ball left his hand, you're just like, all right, what wide receiver is wide open downfield that he's hitting in stride and making a big play out of? And just that level of confidence that he displayed. And I think the level of confidence that fans got watching him in the second half of last season was just an exponential growth. And to your point, I think just carrying that over would be such a huge, just to kind of confirm what we saw at the second half of last season. And then just, again, maybe improving a little bit on that deep ball accuracy, even again, just hitting a couple of those layups. We saw, again, kind of in the San Francisco game, a couple of those missed. Like those are the things where, if, again, he just takes incremental steps in that direction, carrying over from what he did in the second half of last year. Again, the sky is the limit for this guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, he showed a ceiling that was as high as basically any quarterback in the NFL. Obviously, Patrick Mahomes has kind of set that bar in a different place and is the gold standard now. But a large reason behind that is simply he's done it for a number of years now, and he's already shown the capacity to kind of reinvent himself and become a different player and do that. And you have to do that kind of every few years in the NFL. Tom Brady is a great example of that. Like that guy had 3 or 4 different styles throughout his decades-long NFL career. If Brady had stayed the same guy he was at the start of his career, I don't think he would have been a fraction as successful as he was. It was his ability to consistently reinvent and change his game 3 or 4 times over that meant that he was able to be basically as good at the end of his career as he was, at the start of his career. Like the same guy. He was 45 years old and still could have played he could have come back last year and been fine. It wouldn't have been, he was still good. That's like a real, I think, hallmark of greatness. Mahomes has already shown, he's already gone through at least one cycle of that. Every young quarterback, the step one is how good can you play over a single season? That's great. That sort of shows, that establishes a baseline among these great players. But what really cements you as a great player is, okay, now the league's just figured out what you do, and they've figured out how to take 20% off your best play. Now change your game and do it again. And if you can do it again and again and again, that's what puts you into the sort of pantheon of great players. If you can't, there are a lot of players, a lot of quarterbacks that are able to be really good for a couple of years, and then they're never quite the same player again.
Yeah, defensive coordinators are really good at figuring out something that you don't do well at some point. It happens to pretty much every single player at the position. And eventually it's going to happen for Love. I think for the most part, Matt LaFleur and Jordan Love did a good job of kind of sidestepping that a season ago. But defensive coordinators are going to try something different. And once they find something that works, they're going to copy and paste the heck out of it until they figure it out. And that's where you kind of have to reinvent yourself. I remember Aaron Rodgers always talking about every single offseason, he would take 1 or 2 things that weren't his best trait, and he would just hammer them through the entire offseason until he got better at them. And those are the things that, again, if he can take incremental steps on a couple of those sort of things this offseason could even be better this upcoming year, but that's going to be paramount to his success moving forward. Really quick, we didn't necessarily have this as a topic lined up for today, but I know it's been a hot second since we have had the opportunity to talk with you. Just your overarching thoughts on the Packers offseason. Of course, they get Jeff Hafley as defensive coordinator. Josh Jacobs is in. Aaron Jones is out. They go get Xavier McKinney. It's been an interesting offseason. Of course, they had a plethora of draft picks that they go get as well. Just your overall thoughts on their offseason.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a good offseason. Obviously, Xavier McKinney is the kind of splash move and a good move. Like, it fits, I think, an area of need for them, and it fits well in terms of the sort of even just the complementary skill sets within that secondary. That was the kind of missing piece, or the one that you would target for a big upgrade at a certain spot. So I think that was a big spend, but a good one for a team that doesn't, usually spend big at all. Josh Jacobs, interesting move. Like, they kind of basically gave him just an updated version of the Aaron Jones contract, but get a guy that hasn't, I think, has a bit more of a kind of durability, reassurance behind him. Like, Aaron Jones is a phenomenal running back, and when he was on song for Green Bay, he makes a real difference to that offense. But there's too many times where he's not on song, or he's injured, or he's just not, as you can't rely on getting that guy every single week. I think they're hoping Jacobs can bring more of a consistency to that spot. And it sort of makes sense from that point of view. It's about as high as you would want to go for a running back. But again, given that they're basically just updating the deal that they already had on the roster with Aaron Jones, it's fine. It's not like they've taken a position that was being paid no money and then gone and thrown a huge contract at it. They've just sort of maintained that. And then, the draft was kind of classic Green Bay draft of a ton of draft picks, some really interesting players in there, and some guys that you like, but volume being the real important thing there.
Yeah, and it's like you said, a very classic Packers type draft where they get a ton of guys. Some guys it felt like they reached a little bit for. Other guys it felt like fell right into their laps, and like they kind of crushed it on day 2 of the draft again with 4 selections at that spot. I want to talk about a couple of the things that you guys, specifically you, have been writing about and talking about both on PFF.com as well as on your podcast. First one is there was an article about 5 offensive linemen that are poised to break out in 2024. And I believe number 1 on that list, actually, I don't know if it was in order or not, but I'm going to pretend that it is, was Rasheed Walker, Packers left tackle, who had a really nice season, especially, again, kind of Jordan Love-esque in the second half of last year, really came on strong. Interesting then that the Packers go and draft a left tackle in Jordan Morgan in the first round. Now, he has some position versatility, so we'll see what happens there. But your thoughts on Rasheed Walker and how he might break out this upcoming year?
Yeah, so obviously part of that is he needs to sort of stave off the Jordan Morgan drafting, and Morgan needs to be used somewhere else. But I think there's a reasonable chance that is possible. That they've got this history, obviously, of drafting these college tackles, kicking them into guard. I think they have a more acute need at guard, so it would make a lot of sense for them to start Jordan Morgan off inside, or maybe just project him inside. Period. I think he does have that skill set. So if we assume Rasheed Walker is actually going to remain at left tackle as the starter, which is definitely not a guarantee the way it is for some of the other players on that list. I mean, I think, it makes sense for him. He was the development he showed last year. Again, like you said, kind of like Jordan Love, the player that you saw in training camp and the player that you saw at the end of the season were like 2 completely different human beings. We saw him, me and Steve here live in Cincinnati for those joint scrimmages. He looked awful. Like you looked at him and you're like, okay, he's huge, he's athletic, but that guy does not look like he belongs playing left tackle in the NFL. By the end of the season, you're like, he's a good starting left tackle who does not give up a lot of pressure. That's an incredible growth arc at a position that generally does take a couple of years for these guys to get adjusted, to get, used to it, and to start playing their best football. So for that to happen sort of inside of a season, let alone 12 months, again, it doesn't necessarily always work like this, where it's just, step up, step up, step up, all nice, neat, and the arrow always heading in the right direction. But an offensive lineman, the sort of 2 or 3 year growth curve is a real thing. So if he's given a second season to keep getting better, I think there's every chance in the world that we end up with a very good player there.
Yeah, I think it's more than 50% chance he ends up at just staying at left tackle. He's looked really good. And obviously it's just OTAs and mini camps, no pads, take out of it what you will. Jordan Morgan struggled a little bit. You could tell they played him at 4 different positions in OTAs and mini camps. And you talk about seeing a rookie with rookie eyes and just his head swimming. You definitely saw that with Jordan Morgan trying to play 4 different positions. But I do think, Green Bay is all about putting their best 5 guys on the offensive line and figuring it out. To me, there's no chance that Rasheed Walker is not one of those best 5. And he does not actually maybe have some of that versatility that some other guys on the offensive line do. So I think it's more likely that he just stays at that spot. And I kind of want to see it that way because, to your point, he looked like a legitimate starter, had a nice game against Nick Bosa and the 49ers in that final game. And it does seem like his arrow is very much trending up. And most teams, I think, would just be like, well, we found our left tackle. And of course, in very Green Bay fashion, they're like, yeah, we'll just take a left tackle in the first round anyway and figure the rest out later.
Yeah, but I think because they have this track record of, almost looking for interior players among tackles, like that almost seems like the approach that they're deliberately targeting college tackles with a view to playing them inside at guard. Like they've got such a track record of doing this now that it can't be coincidence. Like it can't just be all these guys seem to just end up inside. They seem to deliberately be targeting this, whether it's they prefer, the athleticism that way or some element of it that they think is an attractive trait to kick these guys inside to guard at the next level. It makes a lot of sense for them to do that with Morgan and leave Walker where he is.
Yeah, it seems very formulaic at this point, and they've certainly been very successful doing it, usually with guys that are taken in the 4th, 5th, 6th round. Now they've got a guy with the talent in the first round, and hopefully he can be as or even more successful than some of those other guys. Another article out there, the top 32 interior defensive linemen, 2 interesting players, Packers on that list. Kenny Clark at number 27, Devontae Wyatt at number 29. I think Packer fans may wonder why Kenny Clark's so low. I don't necessarily disagree with it. I think other people might be surprised to see Wyatt so close to Kenny Clark, but your thoughts on those 2 players in their ranking on that specific list?
Yeah, Kenny Clark is kind of interesting. Like for a couple of years, he was basically the modern nose tackle prototype, right? We'd kind of gotten rid of the era of these monstrous 330-pound, Ted Washington type 2-gap nose tackles. They'd gone. They didn't exist. Nobody was 2-gapping anymore. Everyone was playing 1 gap. And like the modern nose tackle was a sort of 310-pound guy, like a guy that was built like Kevin Williams, in the past for the Vikings, who was their 3-tech. Like he was the small guy. He was the pass rusher of the Williams wall, not the nose tackle. But that's what modern nose tackles were built like. And they were good enough to hold up over the nose, against centers, against double teams, but they had the quickness and the speed and the penetrating ability to get in the backfield and disrupt, just like those sort of old school 3 techniques. And, for a couple of years, I think Kenny Clark was as good as it got at that position. And he's just fallen off. And it's not like it's not like he reached the age where that's it. Time's done. Like we're on the decline. Like he's young. He just hasn't recaptured that level yet for a while. And there's a few players in the NFL that are like that seem to have sort of declined before their time. And he's still a really good player. I mean, you don't make a rankings like that without being a good player. Right. But it sort of feels like we know there's more there. Like we've seen more from him. We've seen a higher level of play from him before. And it's sort of, certainly from my perspective, I'm kind of left wondering, like, why we had the drop off, and are we ever going to get back to that level?
Yeah, I think 2 things that I'm somewhat hopeful on. I think one, that exact sort of decline from him coincided with this Joe Barry defense that was a little bit more, I think, passive. And I do think there's some hope that with Jeff Hafley and these guys trying to get upfield more and be more penetrating and be more disruptive, that maybe, just maybe, fingers crossed, we see more of a disruptive Kenny Clark. And then 2, despite the fact that he is still young, he was drafted when he was 20 years old, and they've never really had that guy that, obviously Mike Daniels was there for the very beginning of it, but for the rest of it, he's had to be the guy that plays like 60 snaps almost every single game of his entire career. And I'm sure in the trenches that just sort of wears on a guy after a while. And I think we saw a little bit of that where he's still young, he's still really good, but you can see he doesn't quite have that same ability that he once did, where he was, again, at the peak of his powers. And again, maybe the talk of the league at that defensive tackle, well, not outside of Aaron Donald and a couple of those guys. But my point stands, like he was really, really good at that point in time.
Yeah, and I've never looked into this properly. I keep meaning to kind of properly research it, but I do feel that guys that get started really early are not necessarily going to have longer careers. They're just you just accelerate everything, right?
Yeah.
Like they decline earlier because they were playing earlier. Like remember Amobi Okoye, the
Oh yeah.
defensive tackle, like he got drafted at like 19 or something. And it was like, you're going to get 15 years out of this guy. He's incredible. And like he was just done by the age of like 27
Yeah.
because he just started earlier. Like the grind, the attrition, you only have so many, miles on the clock, so much tread on the tires, and it declines at the same rate. It's just a case of how early you got started on that. So that's potentially part of it. But I do think you're right that I mean, not just Kenny Clark, but that entire defensive personnel group has a chance to be revitalized under a new scheme and with a new coaching system.
And I think Devonte Wyatt very much in that as well. I think that type of defense plays perfectly to his skill set. I know you mentioned in the article how much his pressure rate went up a season ago. I think we could even see another step in that this year, playing in this style of defense. And of course, the big thing for Wyatt is going to be finishing those plays, and we'll see if he can do that in 2024. I want to ask you about a couple other things really quick before we get you out of here. One, I know you recently did a draft of potential difference makers in 2024. I believe Dontavian Wicks was one of the first guys off of your board in that particular draft. I know Aaron Jones was also on that list, but your reasoning for putting Dontavian Wicks early in that selection?
Yeah, I think Wicks is a really good player, a fun guy, and obviously the sort of I think he's the one that has the potential to become Green Bay's number one receiver, if in fact anybody ever emerges as that, or if they're just going to have this receiving core of like 10 guys that are all really useful, but not necessarily ever find a true traditional number one type of player. And honestly, I don't know that you need one of those in today's NFL. Like to
Agreed.
me, it's more important to have the aggregate, the composite of the skill set complete than it is to have everything funneled through one guy. So I don't know that it's a necessary thing for Green Bay to ultimately find this number one guy. But if they do stumble on one, I think Wicks is actually the most likely guy they have on the roster to become that. I know everyone is sort of going to be focusing on other players there, on Christian Watson, say, but I think Wicks is the guy that's got that skill set. You watch his tape, it's sort of like a little bit of a poor man's Justin Jefferson, the way he moves. He's got that kind of slightly unusual way of moving around and the fluidity to his movement. Unlike Jefferson, you can't necessarily point to any one overwhelming physical trait, but he's just really good at everything. So given where he started and where he's already come to, I think, again, if the arrow keeps going up for him, and that's a question mark with basically the entire Green Bay roster because it's so young, and so it is for Wicks as well. But if the arrow does keep going up for him, he could be an absolute star.
Yeah, he's been one of my favorite players to keep tabs on. And early in last year, Justice Mosqueda and I think basically did like a weekly episode of like, where's Dontavian Wicks at? It felt like one of my favorite things of this offseason is seeing more people stumble upon his tape as they dig deeper and deeper into the Packers stuff. And I know Mina Kimes was talking about him. Josh Norris was talking about him. You were talking about him. It's just like, it's really fun to see some more of like the national media get to know some of these Packers that were a little bit under the radar through the course of the season and seeing, what they're capable of. I talk about all the time about the wide receiver, and you're kind of mentioning it with Justin Jefferson, and there's not any one trait, but there's an artistry to their game. And I'm certainly not putting them in the and I know you're not either, the pantheon of a Justin Jefferson or a Devontae Adams or a Stephon Diggs or anything, but those guys have like an artistry to their skill set at the receiver position. And to your point, Wicks has a bit of that, and it's so fun to watch. And I think they're just scratching the surface of what he's capable of.
Yeah, definitely. There's something kind of there's no real logic to this, but there's something slightly rewarding about players like that as well, because like it's easy to see why Tyreek Hill or Randy Moss is amazing, right? Like they're obviously bigger, stronger, faster, whatever it is, than the guy who's trying to cover them. And it's like, okay, that's easy. And it's easy for them as well because they're just physically more imposing. But with guys like Justin Jefferson or Cooper Kupp or Devontae Adams, or, these guys that don't have that, like none of those guys have a particular athletic trait that's just overwhelming relative to the guys trying to cover them. It's the craft. It's them being good at what they do, and them using technique and savvy and knowledge to get open rather than simply saying, I'm better than you, I'm going to get open, there's nothing you can do about it. it's sort of fascinating to watch those guys because it doesn't come easy. Like they have to actually work at it and come up with a game plan and a strategy to get the success that some of these other guys are able to get just because they're bigger, stronger, faster.
Yeah, some of my favorite people to absolutely watch on tape every week are those exact type of players, because it's a beautiful thing to watch, and how they go about uncovering themselves and getting an open in a league that's now all about finding that ability to separate and get easy throws for your quarterback. All right, last thing before I get you out of here really quick. You guys did an interesting look, and you were kind of breaking down like top players for different teams, and you look at Green Bay and you look at their top 3 to 5 players, and it may not look that impressive in comparison to maybe some of the other top teams, but the Green Bay Packers are loaded with young talent, and the depth and the, I think, kind of high level capability of some of these young players is, I think, what separates them. As you look ahead to this upcoming season, how do you place a team like that, where maybe, again, their top 3 to 5 players isn't quite there yet, but there's so many guys just chock full of potential, and they're so deep all over the place, and we've already seen them compete last year? Like, how do you kind of place them in this upcoming season?
I think it's really hard because I think they have an incredibly broad range of outcomes because of that. We have a tendency to look at a team like Green Bay, who's the youngest roster in the NFL 2 years in a row, and again, think that the arrow is going to go up for everybody, right?
Yep.
Young players every year, they're going to get better and better and better. And when that happens, after 2 or 3 years of Green Bay, you're going to have the new Chiefs. And it might happen that way, but it doesn't always. And in fact, the chances are it's probably not going to for a lot of those players, right?
Yep.
And the question is, how many are going to take a big step forward? How many are going to stagnate? How many are actually going to take a step backwards? Or, how much does the sort of just overwhelming volume of young players result in this slightly janky consistency that's just never going to kind of all coalesce and gel into this team that we all expect? They feel a little bit like there's a like a trend that people do in Football Manager, the soccer management game, right? Where you always try and find the exciting young player to sign, and you end up with this team full of 21-year-olds with like maximum potential, right? With like 98 potential through the roof. And you never actually let it get to the stage where they're good enough to win the Champions League, because you just keep like, oh, this guy's 24 now. Let's find the next guy, right? Let's go get the next exciting 21-year-old. So Green Bay almost feel like they're in that zone right now where they've assembled this like insane roster of young players, but are they actually going to get to that stage where there's enough veteran leadership and just enough experience and enough sort of older talent for it to all like come together and become this championship roster? Or are they just going to be kind of stuck in the potential phase for a couple of years until they find, something different?
Well, it's funny in both of those scenarios, in football and in the other football, whichever one you want to clarify is which, you end up sometimes where development and winning don't always necessarily go hand in hand. Sometimes you get to that level of development, and then all of a sudden you start winning games, and all of a sudden it's like, all right, now it's time to win. Like we need to get better guys in, and some of those guys that are still developing start taking a back seat, and then their development, like you said, stagnates, and now you end up in this sort of situation where you're trying to win, but you're not trying to develop this core any longer. I think that's what's going to be so important for this Packers team is, they have the ability to win right now. We saw that just a season ago, but the development of all these young players on this team is still paramount to their ultimate success, which maybe could be in 2024, but might still be in 2025 or 2026 if they can keep these guys trending in the right direction. I would love to win this season. I think that's, again, within their purview, but man, if they could continue to develop at the right pace, I think that might end up even ultimately being better for this team in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, being so loaded with young talent gives them a very long runway, almost regardless of how good they are this year. They're
Yep.
well positioned that unless there's a complete and total collapse amongst a big percentage of those young guys, they should be in a good position for years. And then it's just a case of how good can they get with the development of them. How many of them are going to take a big step together? Because there is a world where the sort of the obvious thing that everyone wants to happen could easily happen. Like if this young group all takes a big step forward together, even if it's just this offseason, like one offseason, they've already shown that they can kind of hang with the best teams in the NFL. If they take that kind of step forward collectively in the offseason as a young group, Green Bay unbeknownst to us right now, are one of the top teams in the NFL. Like we're just not going to see it until week 1, or however long you get into the season until we actually believe it's happening. But like if that's happened this offseason, the Packers are one of the best teams in football.
We're going to end on that very beautiful, happy thought. Sam, you are the absolute best. Thank you so much for joining. Tell us all where we can find the PFF NFL podcast, and tell us all about it.
Yeah, search for it wherever you get your podcast, whether it's audio form or whether it's on YouTube. You'll find us.
Yeah, he and Steve do a tremendous job. Make sure to check it out. It's appointment NFL viewing. You're not going to want to miss it. Of course, you can find him at PFF_Sam. You can find me at Andy Herman NFL. You can find the podcast at Pack-A-Day Podcast. That's going to do it for Sam and I. Until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.